There are days when your work feels like it disappears the moment you finish it, swept away, forgotten, as if it never mattered at all. You start to wonder if anything you do quietly, without anyone watching, could ever truly count for something. Somewhere, on an old wooden windowsill, someone has been proving otherwise for longer than you'd guess. Here's where it begins.
Dead.
There was a row of small glass jars lined along a warped windowsill in the back corner of the barn, each one holding a fistful of soil in a shade slightly different from the next. None of them labeled, none of them explained. Late afternoon light came through a gap in the boards and settled on the dust that had gathered on the glass over what looked like years. A young man stood over them with a broom still in his hand, forgetting the task he had come in to do. He had been on the farm 3 weeks, and most of that time it felt like standing in a room where everyone else already knew the ending of a story he hadn't been told the beginning of. His name was Julian, and he had grown used to being handed the smallest jobs, sweeping, hauling, waiting to be told what came next. He crouched down near the sill, tilting his head to study the jars without touching them. Some held soil, so dark it looked wet even though it wasn't. Others were pale, crumbling, almost ash-gray. None of it made sense to him. A voice came from behind, low and unhurried, before he heard footsteps. "Don't move those," the voice said. Julian straightened up fast, embarrassed, though he hadn't touched a thing. The old man who owned the farm, Mateo, walked in with the kind of quiet that made the barn feel smaller. He didn't look at Julian. He looked at the jars, the way a person looks at old photographs they've seen 1,000 times and still can't put down. Julian asked what they were. Old dirt, he guessed out loud, immediately feeling foolish for guessing at all. Mateo ran 2 fingers along the nearest jar, clearing a thin line through the dust, and said only that the ground had a way of talking, if a person was willing to listen. Then he turned and walked back out toward the fields, leaving Julian alone with the smell of old wood and a question that had no obvious shape yet. The barn held onto the day's heat long after Mateo had gone. Julian finished his sweeping without much attention to it, his eyes drifting back to the sill every few minutes. He told himself it was nothing. 3 weeks in, he had learned that most of what happened on this farm looked like nothing until it wasn't. The farm itself sat at the edge of a county road that saw little traffic beyond the occasional grain truck, a modest spread of fields bordered by an old windbreak of cottonwoods on the western side and a low creek that ran dry most summers. Mateo had worked this ground since before Julian's own parents had married, long enough that most of the neighboring families measured their own histories against his without quite realizing they did it. People in town spoke of him the way they spoke of weather patterns, something reliable and a little mysterious, present so long it had become part of the landscape rather than separate from it. Julian hadn't known any of that when he arrived, only the barest facts passed along through his cousin's letter. He was learning it now in pieces, the way he seemed to learn everything here, sideways and slow, through observation rather than explanation. Planting season was close, closer than Julian had realized until he heard 2 of the seasonal hands talking about it near the equipment shed. There was a tightness in their voices, the kind that came from knowing a bad guess in April meant a bad harvest in September. Julian didn't have much to offer in that conversation. He didn't know the fields the way they did. He didn't know what Mateo saw when he crouched down in a row and went still for no obvious reason. What he did know was numbers. He trusted numbers the way some people trust a clock. So when a traveling salesman rolled a dusty pickup into the yard one morning with a case of soil testing kits, glossy boxes with vials and color charts, Julian was the first one to walk over. The salesman talked fast, the way people do when they're selling something they've said 100 times before. He set up a folding table in the yard, unpacking a row of identical boxes, each one printed with a photograph of a smiling farmer holding a clipboard. 5 minutes, he promised, and the kit would tell you nitrogen, phosphorus, pH, everything measured, nothing left to guess. He held up a small vial of blue liquid like it was something rare, tilting it in the light so the color caught the sun. A couple of the seasonal hands wandered over, curious, turning the boxes over to read the fine print on the back, but none of them reached for their wallets. Julian did. He bought one before he'd even thought to ask Mateo, counting out crumpled bills from the pocket of his overalls while the salesman thanked him twice and moved on to pack up the rest of his table. It felt like relief, holding something in his hands that promised a clear answer. The kind of relief Julian hadn't felt much of since arriving here, where most of what he needed to know seemed to live only inside an old man's silence. He carried the box back to his room above the equipment shed and read the instructions twice that night by lamplight, already picturing the moment he would hand Mateo a card full of numbers and finally have something solid to offer this place instead of just his hands and his willingness to sweep floors. That afternoon, while Mateo was out mending a fence line on the far side of the property, Julian carried the kit to the eastern plot, the section he'd been assigned to clear of stones the week before. He worked through the steps carefully, dipping, shaking, waiting. The vial turned a bright, satisfied green. The char on the box called it excellent. Julian stood there a long moment, looking at that green color like it had settled something important. He found Mateo just before dusk, the old man's shirt darkened with sweat along the spine, his hands still smelling of creosote from the fence posts. Julian held out the card with the results, proud in a way he hadn't expected to feel. Mateo took it, glanced at it for less than a second, and set it down on the fence rail without comment. He walked instead to the eastern plot himself, crouched at the edge of it, and picked up a handful of the soil Julian had tested. He held it near his face and breathed in, eyes half closing the way a person's do when trying to place a half-familiar song. He rolled it slowly between his thumb and two fingers, watching how it broke apart, or didn't, the pale grains sifting down through the gaps in his knuckles. He pressed a small clump flat against his palm, testing whether it would hold its shape or crumble at the first pressure. It crumbled. Then he let what remained fall back to the ground and said only two words. Not ready. He said the seed would fail there if it went in now, his voice carrying no more urgency than if he'd been commenting on the weather. Julian felt something tighten in his chest, something between disbelief and frustration. He pointed at the card, at the green vial still sitting where Mateo had left it. The numbers were right there, he said, exact, measured, undeniable. Science didn't lie, he said, his voice rising with a heat he hadn't planned on. He asked, almost before he could stop himself, whether Mateo was just holding onto an old way of doing things because it was familiar, not because it was true. Mateo didn't answer that. He looked at Julian for a while, long enough that the silence itself became the answer, and then he turned and walked toward the house without another word. The space between them that evening felt wider than the field itself, and Julian stood alone at the edge of the eastern plot with a green vial in his hand and no idea what to do with the doubt now settling into him. He replayed the exchange more than once while he finished his evening chores, feeding the chickens later than usual, latching the barn doors with more force than the latches needed. He wasn't angry at Mateo exactly. He was angry at the shape of the conversation itself, the way it had ended without either side actually losing, which somehow felt worse than losing outright. He had wanted Mateo to argue back, to point at something specific and be wrong about it, so Julian could point at the card in his hand and be clearly, simply right. Instead, he'd gotten silence, and silence didn't leave much to push against. Sleep came late that night. Julian kept circling back to the same thought, turning it over the way Mateo had turned the soil. He was sure of the numbers. He was less sure, suddenly, of what the numbers were actually measuring. He lay awake in the small room above the equipment shed that had been given to him when he first arrived, listening to the farm settle into its night sounds, a dog somewhere down the lane, the tin roof ticking as it cooled. 3 weeks earlier, he had come here with almost nothing, a duffel bag and a letter from a cousin who knew Mateo from church, promising steady work and a place to sleep in exchange for whatever labor the season required. He hadn't expected to feel this unsettled by a jar of dirt and 4 words spoken by an old man who barely looked at him. The truth Julian didn't say out loud, not even to himself in the dark, was that he had come here partly to disappear for a while. Back home, nothing he did seemed to land anywhere. Jobs ended before they started meaning anything. People forgot his name within a week of meeting him. He had hoped a farm might be simple, might ask less of him emotionally even as it asked more of his back and his hands. Instead, on his third week, he had discovered that the simplest-looking things here, a shelf of jars, a silence between two sentences, seemed to carry more weight than anything he'd left behind. In the days that followed, Julian chose not to argue again. He decided instead to watch, the way a person watches whether they don't yet understand. He began following Mateo at a distance, never asking questions, just paying attention to what the old man's hands did when no one was supposed to be looking. He noticed the rhythm of it first. Mateo never rushed a field. He would walk a row, stop without warning, and lower himself onto one knee. He'd take a handful of dirt, close his hand around it, open it again slowly. Sometimes he smelled it. Sometimes he simply held it, still, like he was listening for something underneath the silence. Julian started keeping a private count in his head, the way a person counts something they don't yet understand the meaning of. For times in one morning, he watched Mateo kneel and go still. Twice he watched him do it in the same row, minutes apart, as though the ground had said something the first time that needed checking again. Julian never once saw him write anything down. Whatever record Mateo kept, it wasn't on paper. One overcast morning, the seasonal hands were arguing near the equipment shed about whether rain was coming before noon, one of them checking a small radio for the forecast, the other insisting his knees already knew the answer. Julian passed close enough to hear Mateo, a little further off, say nothing at all, just glance once at the sky and once at a low line of clouds sitting over the ridge, then walk on toward the north field as if the matter had already been settled without a word spoken. The rain came 11:40, exactly as the knee had promised and the radio had not. Julian tried the kneeling and touching himself a few mornings later, choosing a different row while no one was watching. He grabbed a fistful of soil and waited to feel whatever it was Mateo seemed to feel. Nothing came. It was just dirt in his hand, cool and slightly damp, meaning nothing to him beyond its own weight. He straightened up, brushed his palm on his jeans, and told himself this was a language he hadn't been born knowing, and maybe never would be. One evening, Mateo caught him at it without meaning to, walking past the fence line just as Julian knelt with a fistful of soil pressed to his nose. Julian froze, half expecting to be laughed at or questioned. Mateo only slowed his steps for a moment, watching without comment, then continued on toward the house. He didn't offer instruction. He didn't offer approval either. But something in the way he'd paused, brief as it was, told Julian he hadn't done anything wrong by trying. He kept at it anyway, in stolen minutes between real tasks, never telling anyone what he was doing or why. Some mornings the soil felt cold and heavy in a way that made his stomach tighten without explanation. Other mornings it crumbled lighter, almost eager, falling from his fingers in loose clusters he couldn't yet read as good news. He began to notice small differences without understanding what any of them meant, the way a person learns the shape of a new word long before they learn its definition. The jars stayed on his mind more than he expected, turning up in the middle of unrelated chores like a question he hadn't finished asking. One overcast afternoon, sent back to the barn to reorganize a shelf of tools, Julian found himself near the windowsill again. He reached out, not meaning to disturb anything, just to look closer at the color of one jar near the end of the row. His elbow caught the edge of it. The jar tipped, rolled, and shattered against the floorboards before he could stop it. He dropped to his knees fast, gathering the broken glass, dreading the sound of footsteps that would surely follow. As he picked up the largest piece, the base of the jar, something caught his eye. Scratched into the glass, small and worn, almost too faint to read, were a few words. Eastfield, after the flood, 1982. Julian went still. He reached for the next jar, carefully this time, turning it slowly in the light. Another inscription, just as small. North Ridge, drought year. A third jar read something about a third season of clover. His breath caught somewhere between his ribs. These weren't scattered samples from different corners of the farm the way he'd assumed. He pulled two more jars close, comparing the faint scratches at their bases, and the pattern became unmistakable. Different years. Same fields. Some of them, he realized with a slow chill, might even be the same patch of ground, marked again and again across seasons that stretched back longer than Julian had been alive. It took him the better part of an hour, working carefully in the fading barn light, checking and rechecking the tiny scratch dates against each other before he trusted his own reading of them. His fingers grew dusty, and his knees ached from crouching so long on the hard floor. But he kept it the way he imagined Mateo might, unwilling to rush toward an answer he hadn't fully earned yet. He lined a dozen jars up along the sill in careful order once he understood what he was looking at, arranging them by the faded dates scratched into their bases rather than by the color of the dirt inside. Eastfield appeared 6 times across those 12 jars, spanning years Julian had to count on his fingers to place, and the soil inside told its own quiet story, moving from jar to jar. The earliest one, marked just after a flood, held dirt gone gray and compacted, almost stone-like where it pressed against the glass. 2 jars later, something had loosened it, a season of clover worked into the ground perhaps, the color deepening, the texture softer. By the most recent jar, the soil had turned a rich, even brown, crumbling apart in his fingers the way good bread crumbles, nothing forced about it. This wasn't a shelf of curiosities. It was a record, kept by hand, of how this land had changed, failed, recovered, and changed again, one slow season folded into the next. Every jar held a memory Mateo had chosen not to explain, only to keep, the way some people keep photographs of children who have long since grown, not to show anyone, just to remember what the growing had looked like. Julian sat back on his heels in the quiet of the barn, glass still scattered near his boots, and understood for the first time that he had been standing in front of a kind of library his whole first 3 weeks here without recognizing a single page of it. He swept up the broken glass carefully, wrapping the shards in an old rag before he threw them out, and said nothing to Mateo about what he'd found. Some things he was beginning to learn were meant to be discovered rather than announced. 2 weeks after planting, the eastern plot told its own story, and it wasn't the one the green vial had promised. The seedlings there came up thin and pale, stalling early, their leaves edged in a sickly yellow that never deepened into green. A few rows over, in soil Mateo had prepared with nothing but his hands and a silence, the shoots stood taller, darker, pushing upward with a strength that made the difference impossible to ignore. Julian walked the boundary between the 2 plots most mornings that week, sometimes twice a day, watching the gap between them widen instead of close. He tried adding water to the eastern rows, thinking dryness might explain it. The leaves stayed thin. He checked the kit's numbers again, running a second test just to be sure the first hadn't been a mistake, and the vial turned the same confident green it had the first time, insisting nothing was wrong. The ground disagreed with the vial in a language Julian was only beginning to understand. By the end of that week, the seasonal hands had started noticing too, one of them joking, not unkindly, that Julian's plot looked like it needed glasses. He laughed along with them on the outside, and felt something heavier underneath it, a familiar shape he recognized from other jobs, other rooms, the sense of being watched, making the same mistake twice before anyone bothered to explain what the mistake actually was. Julian walked the 2 plots side by side more than once that week, trying to make sense of what his eyes were telling him against what the numbers had told him weeks earlier. He found Mateo by the fence line again, this time without a card in his hand, without an argument ready. He asked quietly why. The kid had said it was fine, he said, still turning the memory of that green vial over like a stone he couldn't set down. Mateo didn't look away from the fence post he was tightening. He said, simply, that it probably was fine. Julian waited for more, confused by how easily Mateo had agreed with him. Then Mateo added 4 more words. For the question it was asked, Julian didn't understand at first, and Mateo didn't explain further. Instead, he reached down, took a handful of soil from the failing plot, and pressed it into Julian's palm. Then he nodded toward the barn, telling him to bring one of the older jars, the one marked for a healthy season, so he could compare the 2 side by side. Julian carried both handfuls out into the light, one in each palm. He closed his eyes the way he'd watched Mateo do a dozen times without understanding why. He brought the soil close to his face, and breathe in. The difference hit him almost immediately, though he couldn't have named it a month earlier. The jar's sample carried a rich, damp scent, something almost alive, the smell of ground that had rested and recovered. The soil from the eastern plot smelled of nothing at all, dry underneath its surface dampness, closed off somehow. He rolled both samples between his fingers next, one hand working each, comparing them the way a person compares two coins by weight alone. The old jar soil held together loosely, crumbling in soft clusters, springing back slightly when pressed, almost resisting his fingers the way something alive resists being reshaped. The eastern plot's soil fell apart into flat, lifeless grains, or clumped into something closer to paste, with nothing in between, no give, no memory of its own shape once disturbed. For the first time, Julian understood what the numbers on that bright green vial had never been built to say. The kit could count nitrogen and phosphorus, could measure acidity down to a fraction. It had no way of asking whether the ground had rested enough, whether it was still breathing in whatever quiet way soil breathes, whether it had a history worth trusting. It answered a narrow question well. It had never been asked a wider one. "I understand now," Julian said, almost to himself. Mateo only gave a small nod, something close to the edge of a smile, passing briefly through the lines around his eyes before he turned back to his work at the fence. Julian stayed a while longer at the boundary between the two plots, the failing rows on one side, the thriving ones on the other, both grown from decisions that had felt equally reasonable at the time they were made. He thought about the salesman's 5-minute promise, about how comforting it had felt to hold a clear answer in his hand instead of sitting with the slower discomfort of not knowing. He didn't blame himself too harshly for it. He simply understood, standing there, that some questions couldn't be rushed toward an answer without losing something true along the way. There is a habit, in a world built for speed, of trusting whatever can be turned into a number over whatever must be earned through the slow use of one's own hands and senses. Machines have given people the gift of quick answers, and in exchange, many have quietly stopped practicing the older skill of paying close attention. When everything can be reduced to data delivered in seconds, does the ability to understand something slowly still matter, or does it wither from disuse like an unused hinge? A number can describe what is true in a single instant. It cannot describe the years that instant came from, the failures folded into the recovery, the quiet accumulation of a place learning to hold itself together again. The shortest path to an answer is rarely the path that leads to real understanding of it. The season moved forward from there, the way seasons do, indifferent to what any one person had just learned. Julian kept working the fields differently after that afternoon, kneeling more often than he used to, staying quiet longer before reaching for any tool. He didn't throw away the testing kit. He simply stopped expecting it to answer questions it was never meant to hold. The weeks after that afternoon at the fence passed differently for Julian than the 3 before them had. He kept working the eastern plot, but not the way he had at the start. He worked compost into the failing rows the way he'd watched Mateo do elsewhere, turning it under by hand instead of rushing it with a tiller. He knelt in that soil most mornings before anyone else was up, cupping it, smelling it, comparing it against memory the way a person tunes an instrument by ear rather than by machine, patient with how slowly the smell began to change from nothing into something almost alive again. Nobody asked him to do this. Nobody checked his work or asked for updates. He did it quietly, the same way Mateo had built an entire shelf of jars without ever once explaining them to anyone. And somewhere in those quiet mornings, Julian stopped needing anyone to notice in order to keep going. The season turned slowly around him while he worked. The cottonwoods along the western edge dropped their first yellowing leaves. The creek bed stayed dry a little longer than usual, and the seasonal hands began talking about which fields would rest through winter and which would be turned once more before the cold set in. None of it felt urgent the way it might have felt to Julian a month earlier. He had learned, without quite meaning to, that most of what mattered on this farm moved at a pace too slow to notice day by day, only visible in hindsight, the way a jar's contents only made sense once set beside several others. The light was low and gold by the time Julian crossed the yard toward the barn one evening near the end of the season, the kind of light that made even tired fences look soft. He carried a small glass jar in one hand, its lid loose, the soil inside packed tight and dark, the same soil he had spent weeks coaxing back to life in a corner of the eastern plot no one had expected much from. Inside the barn, the row of jars waited on the sill exactly as it always had, dust gathering faintly along the edges of the older ones. Julian found a space at the very end of the row, a gap just wide enough for one more jar, and set his own carefully into it. He didn't add a label. He didn't need one. He already knew everything that soil had been through to get there, every measurement it had failed, and every quiet correction that came after. He stepped back to look at the full length of the sill, and something in the shape of it stopped him. The gap he had just filled wasn't an accident of leftover space. It sat at the exact end of the row, the precise width of a single jar, as though it had been left open on purpose, waiting long before Julian had ever walked into this barn. He counted the jars slowly from one end to the other, the way he had the first time he'd understood what they were, only now his own place among them made the counting feel different, less like reading someone else's history and more like standing inside a sentence that had been waiting for him to finish it. Dust motes drifted through the low light near the window, settling faintly onto glass that had already gathered decades of the same quiet fall. Out past the fence line, Mateo was bent over a section of rail that had gone crooked with age, working a nail loose with slow, patient movements. He paused for just a moment, as if some sound too quiet to name had reached him, and turned his head slightly toward the barn. He didn't walk over. He didn't call out. He only gave a small nod into the fading light, then bent back to the fence, continuing the work that had been waiting for him long before this particular evening, and would likely be waiting long after it. Julian stood a while longer at the window, looking at the jar he had placed, and at all the years lined up beside it that he hadn't been there for, and understood, without either of them ever needing to say it aloud, that he had just become part of something that had never once needed an audience to be true. Outside, the light kept fading the way it always did at that hour, indifferent to what had just happened inside the barn, indifferent to jars and fences and the long, unhurried patience it took to fill either one properly. Somewhere past the windbreak, a dog barked twice and went quiet. The row of jars sat exactly as it had for years, one gap smaller now than it had been that morning, the rest of the sill waiting the way it always had, for whatever came next. Have you ever kept something ordinary, a jar of soil, an old photo, a worn tool, just to remember how far you've come? And when Julian placed his own jar into the space Mateo had quietly saved for him, did you feel him finally realize his work had never gone unseen? Thank you for reading every comment you leave. See you in the next story from Oakridge County.